We saw a lot of injuries from quadcopter drones. These are remotely controlled fixed wing drones which hover. They have guns on them, they have cameras on them, and they're flown all over the place in Gaza. We saw many people shot by them. They were flown into hospitals. One of my friends was shot in the chest in the operating theatres at Nassau. Not when I was there, it was before I was there. A quadcopter was remotely controlled, presumably by someone in Tel Aviv or somewhere, flown into the hospital, shot him in the chest when he was in the operating theatre. I also saw victims, young women who had been shot whilst in their tents in Al-Mawasi, quadcopters hovering over the tents, spraying bullets indiscriminately onto the tent.
The children seem to be specifically hit by quadcopters, and lots of them were sort of shot in the back, in the head, in the upper torso. They're operated by somebody that's watching what they're doing, so I assume that they are targeting children.
So the drones would come down and pick off civilians, children. And we had description after description. This is not, an occasional thing. This was day after day after day, operating on children who would say, I was lying on the ground after a bomb had dropped, and this quadcopter came down and hovered over me and shot me.
In theory, precision drone technology should reduce collateral damage and civilian casualties. But in Gaza, evidence indicates the opposite may have occurred. This is the damning core claim of a study by Brown University's Costs of War project. It's titled Lethal Precision Without Accountability and looks at Israel's use of quadcopters in Gaza. The Israeli army flatly rejects deliberately targeting civilians or children, but a team of researchers, including an American ER doctor who worked in Gaza, a former Pentagon targeting chief, and a 32-year State Department director, say the Israeli military has been using a new class of cheap single-soldier drones to shoot people at close range, including, fatally, children. Without action, they warn it risks becoming a template for other militaries to copy. I'm joined now by medic and lead author of the study, Dr. Mimi Saeed, and her co-author, former State Department human rights official Charles Blaha. Mimi and Charles, welcome to the show. Mimi, just to start, take us back to Gaza in August 2024. What were you seeing coming through the doors of Nasser and Al-Aqsa that made you start documenting these cases specifically?
Hi, thanks for having me. Yes, in August of 2024, it was my first medical mission. At that time, we were seeing quite a few injuries, but one of those injuries was very peculiar in that we were seeing children, very young children, under the age of 12, with single shots to the head, to the neck, to the chest. And usually these kids would arrive dead to the hospital, at Nasser Hospital, where I was stationed. It was part of our practice to do an ultrasound to make sure there was no other injuries on the child. And in this, we found no other injuries. There would be single shots and no other injuries. There were about 3 children that I was actually able to stabilize and take to the CT scan, where we discovered they had single bullets lodged either in their brain, in their neck. And we saw many more. And just given the nature of the situation and treating these children, I wasn't able to document all of them. But I was able to document about 18 of them.
Now, the report's central irony is that quadcopters are sold as precision technology that should protect civilians and reduce collateral. Charles, could you explain the gap between that pledge and the reality that you've found?
Well, first of all, thanks for having us. The gap happens in practice. You mentioned that that Israel says that they don't intentionally target civilians. Well, that's really paper. Is in the field otherwise. We know, for example, that Israel's targeting practice has resulted in massive civilian casualties. And we know that a disproportionate amount of those are children. So what appears to be happening here is that Israel's general targeting practices seem to have carried over into their use of these tactical drones.
There may be a slight lag just coming from the connection. But the second step in this research, I suppose, after establishing the use of quadcopters in civilian attacks, is then suggesting intentionality behind the targeting of civilians here. Mimi, while in Gaza, you documented 18 cases of child patients in a month, as you described, with these single small caliber rounds to the head, neck, chest. Now, many of these children arrived with no wounded adults around them. Why was that detail so relevant in drawing your conclusions?
Because the argument would be these are collateral damage. This was crossfire. They were trying to target an adult near them, and they just happened to get shot. None of these cases was that actually happening. And it's routine practice for me when I was in Gaza to ask family members, whoever was eyewitness, what happened, where were you? And each time they would say it was a quadcopter. The child was doing something very benign, and they came in, they were shot, they were either playing soccer or flying a kite, and they just had a gunshot to their head. And eyewitnesses saw a quadcopter or heard a quadcopter.
Now, Charles, I imagine this doesn't sit too well with international humanitarian law. To be clear, Israel isn't party to the additional Protocol 1, but it says it follows customary international human rights law. Just talk us through the key legal breaches this implies. And I'm curious, could it play into the ongoing case for genocide?
Well, the three key international humanitarian law provisions are this. First, in military operations, military standing between civilians and combatants. Second, militaries must take precautions to protect civilians. And third, that militaries must use lethal force only in cases of military necessity. Dr. Syed has already said that there, by eyewitness testimony, there's no indication that many of these uses were in cases where there was active combat, that these were in cases where Israeli forces were under threat, or that anybody else was under threat. This appears to be, at least in some cases, and maybe more, intentional targeting of civilians, and that could feed into evidence of genocide. In fact, on June 23rd, after the article this article was published, the UN published a report that talked about intentional targeting of children in Gaza, and among other things, mentioned Israel's use of quadcopters.
Now, eyewitness attribution is a heavy part of the report. There are combined evidentiary bases, but it is very, very central that you have these testimonies from eyewitnesses who say that quadcopters were behind the attacks. You also combine this with data, the sheer scale of the toll, which is now over 73,000 Palestinians since October, and of course the civilian to combat ratio, which even by Israel's numbers is at least 3-1. But Mimi, would you just talk us through what the attribution rests on in terms of eyewitness testimonies? What did the families and witnesses of these attacks tell you about how they happened?
Yeah, the families told us that these were done by quadcopters. They were eyewitnesses, not necessarily family, but people that were actually there that saw this happen. But the other thing to mention is the intentionality part of this, which is there are soldiers on social media and interviews admitting to targeting children, not just through quadcopters, but actual snipers, and saying that they can be away from this area like a video game, and they can choose their target. And this is described in detail in the UN report that Charles was just talking about, that this technology does exist and it is being used heavily in Gaza, and to this day is what's important to mention.
Mm-hmm. But it's also your testimony that's very relevant as a medic who operated in Gaza. Now, you are also the lead author of the paper. I imagine it's not the norm in academic research, and some would say maybe it risks objectivity in analysis. Just tell us, what would you say about the importance and also the complications surrounding eyewitness evidence when it comes to the genocide in Gaza?
It's important because journalists aren't allowed into Gaza, independent journalists, and the journalists that are there that are trying to cover this issue are being shot or being killed as well. So the only eyewitnesses left are people like myself, foreign doctors. Now, if it was just me saying that we saw children with gunshot wounds in their head that were coming in shot with quadcopters, I could understand where we would say, oh, this is maybe not objective findings, but we have dozens and dozens of doctors saying the exact same thing. We don't know each other. We've never talked to each other. We've gone in different times at different hospitals. And we all saw the same thing. We all witnessed the same thing. So it behooves us to investigate this and to talk about intentionality, because it can't be anything else.
Now, of course, Israeli bullets don't just come from Israel. They're made by corporations. Elbit Systems is one name that comes up in the investigation. They were also provided by foreign governments, namely the US. Charles, you worked in the State Department office responsible for Leahy law vetting, i.e. deciding whether foreign military units implicated in human rights violations can receive US assistance. In other words, there's a law designed to filter this out. In your professional view, should Israel's military still be getting through this filter?
Well, what happened was, in effect, the State Department has stopped enforcing the Leahy law with regard to Israel. It has never enforced the Leahy law with regard to Israel. It's enforced it with regard to every other country to which we give assistance, and it actually works fairly well. Israel is an exception. And with regard to military technology, there is now a provision in the current Defense Department funding bill that would require further U.S. cooperation and integration of military technology with Israel, with one specific country. And this is very, very worrisome with regard to Israel. The other thing to keep in mind when it comes to intentionality is, no matter what Israeli officials say about their rules of engagement, no matter what they say about their adherence to international law, there's a larger context at work here. And the larger context is that in the wake of October 7th, there are many in Israel who believe that there are no innocent people in Gaza, and that even children are not innocent because, in this way of thinking, they are future terrorists. So that's a lot of what is fueling this.
But that's a view that may be held in Israel. Why does that translate to the US? You say that Israel is an exemption to the Leahy law. Can you shine any light on why that is?
Well, because Israel has always gotten special treatment by the State Department and by the Defense Department. They've traditionally been a very close partner. And one of the things that's politically reinforcing this in the U.S. is that in the Trump administration, one of the bedrock sources of support for the president and for this administration comes from evangelical Christians, fundamentalist Christians. And they believe that Israel, they are the chosen people of God. And that they are entitled by God to the land, and that anything they do to defend it, especially after October 7th, is justified.
Thank you. And Mimi, one of the fears expressed in the report is that this becomes a template that other militaries copy, that Gaza was an experimental testing ground. Would you just remind us what that war zone would look like if extrapolated, of what you saw this quadcopter violence do to children and the conditions that you were forced to treat them in?
Yeah, it sets a very dangerous precedent when children are fair game to target and to shoot, to kill, and they have no immunity, no protection. That is a very dangerous precedent to set. But I do want to mention and talk about the proposal for the US and Israel to merge military technologies and what that means. We're already seeing impunity with Israel, complete impunity, no accountability. And to add this merger would mean that they have complete access to US military technology, but also we would be signing off even further on the way that they use their technology that's provided from us, even more blatantly than already is. This is a very dangerous point in the timeline, and that's what we need to understand is with the track record of Israel and how they target civilians and children, we are saying essentially that we want to merge that military technology and power.
So specifically, the report makes some recommendations. It calls on the US to suspend transfers of tactical drone tech to Israel. The US is the largest arms supplier and a drone leader itself. What would it take, Charles, given the situation you've described, the climate you've described inside the State Department, what would it take for your recommendations to be taken up?
Well, in the short term, it's going to be very difficult. However, one of the things that's happening is that public opinion about Israel in the U.S. is changing. And it's changing in part because of Israeli practices in Gaza. And so there have been votes on aid to Israel, on military assistance. There have been votes on weapons packages. None has succeeded so far, but the margins are getting closer. So in the short term, unfortunately, I don't see a change. However, I think in the long term, there will be growing congressional opposition and effective congressional opposition to arms transfers to Israel, especially after the November elections. It appears that Democrats, who are the bulk of the opposition to these things, will gain some power in Congress.
Thank you. And Dr. Mimi Saeed, as the lead author on this paper, do you have closing thoughts before we move on to the next segment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, everything that Charles has said, we have to take action. We have to investigate these claims, and these eyewitnesses that we're seeing in Gaza of quadcopter technology, because it provides even more impunity to the units and the commanders that are participating in this.
Charles Blaha, Dr. Mimi Saeed, thank you so much for joining us here on MEE Live.
Thank you.
Thank you.